Hello, and welcome to Cardboard and Plastic. Today's video is going to be controversial to some people. What is vintage? So I have some cards lined up in the back, and I don't think anybody would really complain about me calling them vintage. I have a T206 Even Commons and Pork Edition, a 1933 Gaudi, that is a Hall of Famer, but Even Commons, I think people would say that's okay, that's vintage. 1952 Bowman, so early Bowmans, and also even the early Topps cards. I don't think anybody would have a problem saying that this is a vintage Hank Aaron. Now, with vintage, I think a lot of people just use the word old. However, many definitions of vintage it's not just old. It's going to be something that is old, having some type of interest or importance or quality in the hobby. So it has to have some type of importance, maybe some quality, or even just recognizable. So I think people just recognize these cards as being vintage. So there's a bunch of other different cards that people consider vintage, and some people, these are like some cutoffs, right? So 1973, I think this Mike Schmidt, this is the last year that Topps did series, so this is like the 5th series of that, and I think that's a big cutoff for a lot of people, is 1973 Topps. Now, some other people would say, well, maybe the 1980 Topps set. So this Rickey Henderson rookie, it's right before the cutoff of when Topps was the last maker of cards. So in 1981, we had the introduction of Fleer, right? And other brands are going to come along. So now I'm going to start to get a little bit controversial. I'm going to add to the 1980. However, the card has to have some type of significance. So for me, this is vintage. The 1982 Topps traded Cal Ripken. So for me, this card is old, but also has some type of historical significance in the hobby, is very important in the hobby. So some people are going to yell and scream. That I consider vintage. However, I will not consider these vintage. Right? So the Donruss rookie, the regular Topps rookie, even the Fleer rookie, even though those are rookie cards, for me, they don't have this importance in the hobby. Now we can even go a little bit later than that. I'm going to say this card is vintage as well. Now, I am not saying that the 1989 Upper Deck set is vintage. I'm saying that this card is vintage. It's old, prior to 1990, and also has significance in the hobby. So we're going to call this vintage as well. However, if I have a common card from 1989 Upper Deck, that is not vintage. And this card, even though I think should be collected more, there's really no significance with this card. You can buy them for $1 or $2 raw. So this card, for me, even though it's old, it doesn't have the significance in the hobby. So for me, this is going to be my definition of vintage. And down in the comments, put down, what do you think vintage is? So for me, the card has to be older than 1990. So this card for me is not vintage. Even though the 1990 Leaf, Frank Thomas, in my opinion, and in the hobby's opinion, is a very important card. I'm going to say 1990s aren't vintage yet. We're going to have to wait to 2030. Then we can actually start including the 1990s as vintage. So we're not going to keep this card as vintage. So my definition of vintage, and I want to hear yours, the card has to be before 1990. but also has to, if it's past 1973, so past 1973, it has to have some type of significance to the hobby. So for me, the 1980 Topps Rickey Henderson, the 1982 Topps traded Cal Ripken, 1989 Upper Deck Ken Griffey, and some other rookies, maybe like the 1984 Donruss Don Mattingly. I would say that that's vintage as well. So the 1970s later get a little bit different, but even if you look at the 1979 Topps set, the only card of importance is really the 1979 Ozzie Smith. All the other cards you can just try to give away. Nobody will even want those. So let me know in the comments, what do you think? And again, have a great day and keep on collecting.